By summer 1940, Adolf Hitler stood on the cliffs of France looking across 22 miles of water at an enemy he could not defeat. Britain was isolated, its army evacuated from Dunkirk without heavy equipment, its cities vulnerable to bombing. Germany controlled Europe from the Arctic to the Pyrenees. Yet within months, this moment of supreme advantage would dissolve into strategic paralysis. The decisions made, and not made, during those critical weeks would ensure Britain survived as an unsinkable aircraft carrier off Europe's coast. From that island, the forces that would eventually destroy Nazi Germany would launch. This is the story of how Germany failed to finish Britain when victory seemed inevitable. The French surrender on June 22, 1940, left Hitler facing a problem he had never seriously planned for: what to do about Britain. His entire strategic vision had focused on continental Europe. The quick defeat of Poland, the stunning victory over France, these validated his belief in Wehrmacht superiority and bold offensive action. But Britain was different. It was protected by the world's most powerful navy and separated by water that German tanks could not cross. Hitler had assumed Britain would seek terms after France fell. The logic seemed obvious to him. Britain had lost its major continental ally. Its army had abandoned equipment at Dunkirk. Continuing the war served no rational British interest. Yet Churchill's government showed no inclination to negotiate. This British defiance confused and irritated Hitler, who had grudging respect for the British Empire and harbored hopes of eventual accommodation with Anglo-Saxon powers. The German military began examining options for an invasion of Britain, Operation Sea Lion. Army planners developed detailed scenarios for landing troops on England's southern coast. The Wehrmacht had proven it could break through fortified positions and defeat larger armies. But every planning session exposed the same fundamental problem: the operation required control of the English Channel. The Royal Navy vastly outnumbered Germany's surface fleet. German naval losses in the Norway campaign had been severe. Admiral Raeder informed Hitler that the Kriegsmarine could not protect an invasion fleet against British naval counterattacks. The only solution was air superiority. If the Luftwaffe could destroy the Royal Air Force and establish dominance over southern England, the invasion might be possible. Everything depended on winning the air battle. Hermann Göring promised Hitler that the Luftwaffe could achieve this victory. In July 1940, German aircraft began attacking British shipping in the Channel and conducting reconnaissance over England. These preliminary operations would escalate into the Battle of Britain, the first major campaign fought entirely in the air. Göring's confidence seemed justified. The Luftwaffe had approximately 2,800 aircraft available for operations against Britain. The RAF Fighter Command had roughly 700 operational fighters. German pilots were experienced veterans of campaigns in Poland, Norway, and France. Many RAF pilots were barely trained newcomers. German intelligence estimated that sustained attacks would destroy RAF Fighter Command within weeks. Once British air defenses collapsed, the Luftwaffe could bomb ports and military installations at will, paving the way for invasion. Hitler authorized intensified air operations and ordered invasion preparations to continue. But he had not yet committed fully to the decision. He remained uncertain whether invasion was necessary or even desirable. This uncertainty revealed a critical weakness in German strategic planning. Hitler had no clear political objective regarding Britain beyond forcing it out of the war. He oscillated between hoping for a negotiated settlement and preparing for invasion. Meanwhile, he was increasingly drawn to his long-term ideological obsession: the destruction of the Soviet Union. In July 1940, Even as the Battle of Britain intensified, Hitler told his military chiefs to begin planning for an invasion of the Soviet Union. He believed Britain continued fighting only because it hoped Stalin would eventually enter the war against Germany. If the Soviet Union was destroyed, Britain would have no hope of a continental ally and would be forced to make peace. This logic was deeply flawed. But it shaped Hitler's thinking. The result was strategic confusion. Germany pursued three contradictory approaches simultaneously, seeking accommodation with Britain, preparing to invade Britain, and planning to attack the Soviet Union. The Luftwaffe's campaign against Britain began in earnest in August 1940. German bombers and fighters attacked RAF airfields across southern England. The objective was clear: destroy British fighter bases, aircraft factories, and radar stations. Force the RAF to commit its fighters to battle where German numerical superiority would grind them down. For several weeks, this strategy achieved results. RAF fighter commands suffered severe losses. Airfields were bombed repeatedly. Pilot casualties exceeded replacement rates. British fighters were being forced to operate from damaged bases under constant pressure. By early September, RAF Fighter Command was approaching a critical point. A few more weeks of sustained attacks on airfields and the defensive system might have collapsed. The attrition was unsustainable. Air Chief Marshal Dowding later acknowledged that Fighter Command's situation was becoming desperate. Then Hitler made a decision that changed everything. On the night of August 25, British bombers attacked Berlin. The damage was minimal. But the psychological impact was significant. Hitler had repeatedly promised the German people that enemy bombers would never reach the capital. Now they had. Hitler was furious and demanded retaliation. Despite Göring's protests that the Luftwaffe was close to breaking RAF Fighter Command, Hitler ordered a shift in targeting priorities. Beginning September 7, the Luftwaffe would concentrate on bombing London and other British cities. The raids would terrorize the civilian population and force Churchill's government to capitulate. This decision to switch from attacking RAF bases to bombing cities was among the most consequential of the entire war. It gave Fighter Command time to recover. Damaged airfields were repaired. New pilots completed training. Aircraft production continued. The pressure that had nearly broken the RAF was lifted just when victory was within German reach. The Blitz, the sustained bombing campaign against British cities, began with massive raids on London. German bombers struck in daylight and at night, causing extensive destruction and civilian casualties. Hitler believed this terror would break British morale and force surrender. Instead, it stiffened British resolve. Churchill's defiant speeches resonated with a population enduring nightly bombing. The strategy of targeting cities had multiple flaws that German leadership failed to recognize. Britain's war-making capacity did not depend on civilian morale in London. The British government did not operate like the Nazi regime. Public opinion mattered. But Churchill would not capitulate regardless of bombing. Most critically, by attacking cities instead of airfields, the Luftwaffe allowed the RAF to continue operating. British fighters could intercept bomber formations, inflicting losses that Germany could not sustain. The Luftwaffe was fighting the wrong battle. By mid-September, it became clear that the Luftwaffe had not achieved air superiority. On September 15, the RAF inflicted heavy losses on German bomber formations attacking London. Hitler ordered Operation Sea Lion postponed. The invasion would not occur in 1940. Officially, the postponement was temporary. The operation might be executed in spring 1941. In reality, the moment had passed. The decision not to invade Britain in 1940 was less a conscious strategic choice than a drift into failure. Hitler never definitively cancelled Sea Lion or committed fully to executing it. He allowed circumstances to make the decision for him. Göring's promises that air power alone could force British surrender proved hollow. The Luftwaffe continued bombing through the autumn and into 1941, but without strategic effect. Britain remained in the war, its military recovering strength, its population enduring. The failure to finish Britain had consequences that extended far beyond 1940. Britain became the base for future Allied operations. As long as it remained in the war, Germany faced strategic bombing of its cities and industrial centers. British forces tied down German troops in North Africa and later Italy. Most critically, Britain provided the platform for American intervention. When the United States entered the war in December 1941, it had a ready-made European ally in base of operations. Without Britain's survival, American involvement in Europe would have been vastly more difficult, perhaps impossible. Yet in summer 1940, Germany had the opportunity to eliminate this threat. The British Army had lost its equipment at Dunkirk. Fighter command was under severe pressure. A successful invasion could have forced capitulation. Instead, German indecision and strategic errors allowed Britain to survive. One decision that has haunted historical analysis was Hitler's halt order at Dunkirk in May 1940. German panzer divisions had raced to the coast, cutting off British and French forces. For 48 hours, Hitler ordered the tanks to halt rather than press forward to capture the port. This pause allowed over 300,000 Allied soldiers to be evacuated to Britain. The reasons for this halt order remain debated. Göring claimed the Luftwaffe could destroy the trapped forces from the air. Army commanders wanted time to consolidate their gains. The rapid advance had left units scattered and vulnerable. The terrain around Dunkirk, crisscrossed with canals, was poor ground for armor. Some historians suggest Hitler wanted to leave Britain a face-saving way out of the war. Whatever the reasons, the result was that Britain's army survived. These soldiers became the core of the force that would eventually return to France on D-Day. The Dunkirk evacuation was portrayed as a disaster in German propaganda, and in purely military terms it was. The British had abandoned France and left massive amounts of equipment behind. But strategically, the evacuation was Britain's salvation. It preserved trained soldiers who would take years to replace. It demonstrated that Britain could rescue its forces even in the worst circumstances. It provided a propaganda victory that strengthened British morale. Hitler's failure to prevent this evacuation represented a critical missed opportunity. Had German forces captured or destroyed the entire British expeditionary force at Dunkirk, Britain's ability to defend itself would have been far weaker. The political pressure on Churchill's government to seek terms would have been immense. Instead, the successful evacuation gave Britain hope and validated Churchill's decision to continue fighting. Throughout summer 1940, Hitler received conflicting advice from his military chiefs. The Navy insisted that invasion was impossible without air superiority. The Army developed detailed invasion plans, but acknowledged the risks. The Luftwaffe promised it could win the war through air power alone. Hitler, lacking a naval background and uncomfortable with amphibious operations, never fully committed to the invasion option. His natural inclination was toward land warfare in the east, where panzer divisions could maneuver. The idea of crossing water under fire from the Royal Navy made him uneasy. Some of his generals later claimed they never believed Hitler was serious about invading Britain. They saw the invasion preparations as pressure tactics meant to force British negotiations. This internal uncertainty meant Germany never pursued the invasion with the single-minded focus that characterized successful German operations. The strategic implications of this failure became clearer as 1940 turned to 1941. Hitler's attention shifted decisively toward the Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa was scheduled for spring 1941. Britain had been reduced to a secondary theater in Hitler's mind. He convinced himself that destroying the Soviet Union would force Britain to make peace. This logic ignored Britain's determination and Churchill's character. It also ignored the fact that Britain was receiving increasing American aid. The Lend-Lease program would provide Britain with the weapons and supplies needed to continue the war indefinitely. By failing to finish Britain in 1940, Hitler ensured that Germany would fight a multi-front war, exactly the scenario that German strategic planners had always feared. The Eastern Front would consume German resources while Britain and later America attacked from the west. German naval commanders understood what the failure to defeat Britain meant. Admiral Raeder repeatedly warned Hitler that as long as Britain remained in the war, Germany's position would deteriorate. British naval power controlled the Atlantic and Mediterranean. German U-boats could harass convoys, but not cut Britain's supply lines. British control of the seas meant that Germany's enemies could move resources globally while Germany was confined to continental Europe. Raeder advocated for a Mediterranean strategy, seizing Gibraltar, Malta, and the Suez Canal to strangle British imperial communications. This might have forced Britain to terms by threatening India and Middle Eastern oil. Hitler showed little interest in these ideas. His focus remained on the Eastern Front. The Navy's strategic concerns were subordinated to Hitler's ideological obsession with destroying Judeo-Bolshevism in the Soviet Union. The Luftwaffe's failure in the Battle of Britain exposed critical weaknesses in German airpower doctrine. The Luftwaffe was designed for tactical support of ground operations, not strategic bombing. German bombers lacked the range, bomb load, and defensive armament for sustained strategic campaigns. Losses to British fighters were severe. By October 1940, daylight bombing of Britain became unsustainable. The Luftwaffe shifted to night bombing, which reduced losses, but also reduced accuracy. The scattered bombing of British cities caused suffering, but did not break Britain's war economy or morale. Göring had promised results he could not deliver. His assurances that the Luftwaffe could win the war alone proved disastrously wrong. Yet Hitler never held Göring accountable for this failure. The consequences would compound in subsequent years as the Luftwaffe faced increasingly superior Allied air forces. British strategic choices during this period stood in stark contrast to German indecision. Churchill made the political decision to continue the war regardless of circumstances. This was not based on rational calculation of odds. In summer 1940, Britain's situation appeared nearly hopeless. It was based on moral conviction that Nazi Germany must be resisted in faith that circumstances would eventually shift in Britain's favor. Churchill's government unified military strategy, intelligence services, and civil defense around the single objective of survival. Resources were concentrated on fighter production. Radar and intelligence allowed efficient use of limited fighter forces. The population endured bombing with remarkable resilience. While Germany pursued contradictory strategies simultaneously, Britain focused every resource on the singular goal of not losing. This clarity of purpose made the difference. The summer of 1940 represented Germany's last opportunity to achieve the quick, decisive victory that its strategy required. Every month Britain survived, its position improved incrementally. Fighter production increased. Pilot training continued. American aid arrived in growing quantities. The longer the war continued, the more Germany's resource disadvantages would matter. Hitler understood this at some level, which explains his increasing focus on seizing Soviet resources. But he never grasped that Britain's survival fundamentally undermined his strategic position. As long as Britain fought on, Germany could not consolidate its European conquests. It had to maintain forces in the West, defend against bombing, and face the possibility of invasion. Britain's survival meant the war would be long, industrial, and ultimately determined by production capacity, the type of war Germany could not win. Internal German assessments in late 1940 reveal an organization struggling to acknowledge reality. Intelligence reports downplayed Britain's fighter production and overestimated damage inflicted by bombing. Commanders blamed weather, unexpected British resilience, and bad luck for the failure to achieve air superiority. Few were willing to tell Hitler that the strategy itself was flawed. The Nazi system's emphasis on personal loyalty over competence meant that officers who questioned decisions were marginalized. Those who delivered optimistic reports Hitler wanted to hear were promoted. This created an information environment where failure was disguised and problems were minimized until they became catastrophic. The failure to defeat Britain should have triggered a fundamental reassessment of German strategy. Instead, it was treated as a temporary setback while attention shifted to the Soviet Union. The decision to abandon efforts to defeat Britain, though never formally articulated as such, locked Germany into a strategic trap. Hitler believed defeating the Soviet Union would force Britain to surrender. This logic was entirely backward. Britain continued fighting precisely because it was not alone, it had American support and hoped for eventual Soviet alliance against Germany. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, Britain gained the continental ally Hitler claimed it was waiting for. Churchill immediately offered Stalin full support despite decades of anti-Soviet rhetoric. The Grand Alliance of Britain, the Soviet Union, and later the United States formed specifically because Germany was fighting all of them simultaneously. By failing to finish Britain before turning east, Hitler created the coalition that would destroy Germany. Historians have extensively debated whether Germany could have successfully invaded Britain in 1940. The consensus is that it would have been extremely difficult, but possibly achievable under specific conditions. If the Luftwaffe had maintained its focus on RAF airfields for another few weeks, fighter command might have collapsed. With air superiority, German forces might have established beachheads in southern England. The Royal Navy would have inflicted severe losses. But desperate circumstances might have produced success. Britain's army was weakly equipped. Home defense forces were barely trained. If German forces had seized ports and pushed inland quickly, they might have forced British capitulation. The question is ultimately unanswerable. But what is clear is that Germany never seriously tried. The combination of Hitler's indecision, Göring's false promises, and strategic confusion meant that the invasion was never executed with the focus and resources it required. The long-term consequences of this failure became fully apparent by 1944. Operation Overlord, the Allied invasion of Normandy, was launched from Britain. Over 2 million American soldiers arrived in Britain in preparation for D-Day. British ports, airfields, and territory provided the logistical base for the invasion. Strategic bombers flew from British airfields to devastate German industry. The elaborate deception plans that confused German defenses operated from Britain. None of this would have been possible if Britain had been defeated or forced to surrender in 1940. Hitler's failure to finish Britain ensured that when Germany finally faced the second front it dreaded, that front would be overwhelming. The combat power assembled in Britain for the invasion of France exceeded anything Germany could match. From this perspective, the decisions of summer 1940 directly determined the outcome of World War II in Europe. German military professionals who survived the war offered various explanations for the failure. Some blamed Hitler's interference in military decisions. Others cited the difficulty of amphibious operations against a naval power. Many pointed to the switch from attacking airfields to bombing cities as the critical error. Few acknowledged the deeper problem: Germany's strategic approach was fundamentally flawed. The blitzkrieg method that worked in Poland and France could not be applied to Britain. Naval power and geography created barriers that mechanized warfare could not overcome. Germany needed a comprehensive strategy integrating air, naval, and ground forces for an extended campaign. Such a strategy was never developed because it required patience, detailed planning, and acceptance of a longer war, all of which contradicted Hitler's approach to warfare. The psychological dimension of this failure is significant. Hitler had won victory after victory through bold action and defiance of conventional military wisdom. The fall of France was perhaps the greatest military triumph in German history. This success reinforced Hitler's belief in his own strategic genius. He increasingly dismissed professional military advice and trusted his instincts. The failure against Britain should have shaken this confidence. But instead Hitler rationalized it. Britain survived not because of German mistakes, but because it was irrational, stubborn, and controlled by warmongers who refused to see reality. This prevented any serious examination of what went wrong. The pattern would repeat in Russia: initial success followed by strategic failure, rationalized by blaming others rather than examining fundamental flaws in German strategy. For Britain, the summer of 1940 became the defining moment of the war. The successful defense against the Luftwaffe and the thwarting of invasion plans entered national mythology. Churchill's speeches captured the spirit of resistance. The RAF pilots who fought in the Battle of Britain became heroes. The civilian population's endurance under bombing demonstrated resolve. This narrative of Britain's finest hour was not mere propaganda, it reflected genuine strategic achievement. Britain had faced Germany alone and survived. That survival kept hope alive for occupied Europe. It demonstrated that Nazi Germany could be resisted. When the Soviet Union was invaded and America entered the war, those nations knew that Britain had held on through the darkest period. The alliance that would ultimately defeat Germany was made possible by Britain's survival in 1940. The contrast between German and British leadership during this period is instructive. Hitler operated through intuition, ideological conviction, and personal will. He dismissed advice that contradicted his assumptions and surrounded himself with sycophants. Strategic planning was fragmented among competing agencies with no unified command. Crucial decisions were made based on emotion. The switch to bombing cities was ordered in anger after Berlin was hit. This approach had succeeded when facing disorganized opponents. But against a determined enemy with clear purpose, it produced confusion and failure. Churchill's leadership style was entirely different. He was dictatorial in maintaining the decision to fight. But he consulted extensively with military professionals, listened to intelligence assessments, and adapted strategy to circumstances. British command structures were unified under the War Cabinet. Resources were allocated rationally rather than based on Hitler's whims. The failure to defeat Britain in 1940 also revealed the limits of air power in that era. Göring and his staff believed that bombing alone could force a nation to surrender. This theory, popular in interwar air power doctrine, proved false. Britain endured massive bombing and continued fighting. Its war economy adapted, factories dispersed, production continued despite raids, civilian morale held. The Luftwaffe lacked the precision bombing capability to destroy specific industrial targets. Night bombing was largely ineffective at hitting anything except general urban areas. The resources Germany devoted to the Blitz produced minimal strategic return. This lesson should have informed German strategy. But it did not. The belief persisted that enough bombing could break enemy will, even as evidence accumulated that it could not. Later, when Allied bombers devastated German cities, Nazi leadership would learn what Britain already knew: air power alone does not win wars. What if Hitler had made different decisions in summer 1940? If the Luftwaffe had maintained pressure on RAF airfields, fighter command might have collapsed. If Hitler had committed to invasion rather than vacillating, Sea Lion might have been executed. If German strategy had focused on Mediterranean operations to strangle British imperial communications, Britain might have been forced to terms. But these alternatives required Hitler to be someone fundamentally different. His entire strategic approach emphasized quick, decisive action followed by another campaign against the next enemy. He lacked patience for extended operations. His ideological fixation on the Soviet Union meant he could never fully commit to defeating Britain. The failure of summer 1940 was not an aberration, it was the inevitable result of Hitler's character and Nazi Germany's strategic culture. They won quick victories against weaker opponents, but could not sustain campaigns against determined resistance. By December 1940, Hitler had issued Directive 21, the operational plan for invading the Soviet Union. Britain was relegated to secondary importance. The Luftwaffe continued bombing British cities through the winter. But these were harassing raids, not part of a coherent strategy. German military planning focused entirely on the Eastern Front. The brief moment when Britain's survival hung in the balance had passed. The war entered a new phase in which Germany faced multiple enemies on multiple fronts. The failure to finish Britain in 1940 meant this situation was permanent. Every subsequent German decision was constrained by Britain's continued resistance. Resources devoted to defending against British bombing could not be used elsewhere. Forces tied down in North Africa and later Italy could not reinforce the Eastern Front. Britain's survival ensured Germany would be gradually ground down by opponents with superior resources. The decisions of summer 1940 set this process in motion. The strategic lesson from Germany's failure to finish Britain is clear and timeless. Wars are won by clarity of purpose, unity of effort, and sustained commitment to achievable objectives. Germany in 1940 possessed tactical excellence, veteran forces, and recent victories. But it lacked strategic coherence. It pursued contradictory goals simultaneously, allowed personal animosities to influence decisions, and made choices based on ideology rather than military reality. Britain succeeded because it had singular purpose: survival, and focused every resource toward that goal. Germany failed because it could not decide what it wanted to achieve regarding Britain and could not commit to any course of action with full resources. Hitler's indecision in 1940 stands as one of history's great strategic failures. A moment of overwhelming advantage was allowed to slip away through confusion and half measures. From that failure, Germany's eventual defeat became inevitable. By the time German forces stood outside Moscow in December 1941, freezing and exhausted, the consequences of failing to finish Britain were fully apparent. British bombers struck German cities. British forces fought in North Africa. British intelligence penetrated German communications. British resolve inspired occupied Europe. American weapons flowed to Britain in increasing quantities. The unsinkable aircraft carrier off Europe's coast had survived. From Britain, the forces would launch that would liberate Europe and destroy Nazi Germany. All of this was possible because in summer 1940, Germany made a series of decisions and indecisions that allowed Britain to survive. Hitler had stood on the French coast looking across the Channel at an enemy he could not defeat. Not because Germany lacked military power, but because it lacked the strategic wisdom to use that power decisively. That failure, born of confusion, arrogance, and ideological blindness, sealed Germany's fate.